All right, so good afternoon, or shall I say good evening to everyone. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to be going over the ELAR 4 through 8 today. I just noticed that it says EC6 there. Ignore that. So this is ELAR 4 through 8 for the most part. What I tried to do was I did put some little on the bottom corner. It'll say EC6 if any of the content applies to the EC6 exam. So just like with the last review that we did for science, you're going to have a little bit of overlapping when it comes to the content that's coming on the exam, because EC6, right, goes up to 6th grade. And then if you're doing science 4 through 8, right, you have those 4th, 5th, and 6th grades that are overlapping. Okay, so I tried to do that with this review, and I hope I got them all on there. So there is a lot of information that is very similar or the same to what you'll be seeing on the EC6 content for those of you that are here with that. So today we're going to be going over competencies 1 to 4, and then I'll be having another review session where we'll go ahead and cover 5 through 9. So there's only 9 competencies for ELAR. And if you have not already taken a look at the website, so there is this NESync website. So I'll drop it here in the chat. Okay, so if you go to the NESync website, you'll be able to get to the exam, the standards themselves. So let me show you what that looks like. You definitely want to have this page bookmarked because it's going to give you all of your competencies for your exam. So again, you can go to whatever your exam is. If you're core 4 through 8, if you're core subjects EC6, and you've never taken the EC6 exam before, you'll be taking the 391. If you've taken the EC6, but you have not been successful on it already, and you took the 291 like last year before, then you would just click on this page. And then of course you could possibly be ELAR 4 through 8. So you would go ahead and click on that one. Okay, so make sure that you go ahead and find your subject area, whatever that may be. And so I'm just gonna, for the sake of today, I'm just going to take a look at the core subjects 4 through 8. But again, you would click on whatever area is going to pertain to you. And then when you scroll down, it's going to give you the option to view the preparation materials. So you want to make sure that, you click on that. And then from there, we're going to go ahead and go to the overview and exam framework. Okay. And so this overview and exam framework is going to show you all of your competencies, right? It's going to give you tell you how many questions are on the test, how much time you have on the test for each subject area. If you're just taking ELAR, so if you're getting certified in ELAR 4 through 8, your entire test is ELAR questions. So there's more depth, I guess, when it comes to the amount of questions that they can ask you. If you're just doing core 4 through 8, there's obviously going to be a lot less questions because you only have a much smaller amount of time. Okay. So I'm going to be clicking on this one here because those of you, for the most part, all of you in here, I think there's maybe 1 or 2 of you that have taken the test last year, but for the most part, all of you are going to be taking the test for the first time. So you want to make sure that you are clicking on this one that says on or after January 1st, because the framework did change a little. Okay, so there are some competencies that were taken out of this exam and they were placed on the Science of Teaching Reading exam. So they're just not assessing you twice on them. Okay, so if you are doing the core 4 through 8, right, these are the subject tests that you'll be taking. If you're doing ELAR, it's 1 hour and 55 minutes that you'll get to do 74 questions. If you're doing just ELAR 4 through 8, right, it's a 5-hour test and they're all ELAR questions. So I don't know the number of questions, but I'm thinking it's probably over 200, something like that. So is that what it is, Laura? No, not that many? Oh, you don't know. Okay. All right. So when you get in here, you'll go ahead and scroll down. You can see what your standards are. It's going to give you that overview, right? What percentage of the test is ELAR? ELAR is the biggest percentage of the test on EC6 on core 4 through 8. And then when you scroll down, this is where you're going to get to the subject exam for ELAR, and then you're going to see your competencies. Okay, so I'm going off of these competencies. And again, the ELAR 4 through 8 is the same competencies as the core ELAR 4 through 8, same thing. If you are taking the old ELAR exam, because you haven't passed that one before, then the competencies are going to be a little bit different. Okay, so there are some things that you'll be seeing, but you'll just have to keep scrolling down because they took out some of the competencies there. Okay, I hope I'm not making this more confusing, but all right. Okay, so you'll be going through and taking a look at those after we have taken a look at a single competency. Okay, we're going to be starting by looking at oral language. And so this is competency number 1. So for this one, the teacher understands the importance of oral language, knows the developmental processes of oral language, and provides a variety of instructional opportunities for students to develop listening and speaking skills. Okay, so oral language, think of the speaking, right, as well as that listening. So it's not just talking. Okay, so for oral language, when we think about that, remember that, you know, and think about it, right? Most children are going to come to school and they're able to speak and listen in at least one language. Okay, we're going to have a lot of students here in the region that are going to be coming to us with maybe their first language was Spanish, right? That's all they're coming to us with, or maybe they've got a little bit of both, right? So that can happen as well. So children are going to be gaining mastery in language by learning the sounds of language, which are phonemes, the meaning generated from language, which are semantics, and then how to place them together, or syntax. Okay, so in everything that's highlighted here, these terms, if you don't know them, write them down because you got to know them, okay, because they may ask you questions related to them. Then language acquisition itself, there is this, I guess you could say, a theory out there, right, that basically humans are born with these innate abilities, right? So children kind of have this ability inside of them to be able to learn language. And so because of those like innate abilities, they're able to listen to family and people, you know, whoever's around them, right? Listen to them speaking and interact with them. So that's why it's really good to be talking to your kids, right? The more you talk to your kids, the more language they're going to start to pick up. And with that, that's how they obtain language. Okay, so if you have kids that aren't having much interaction, obviously they're going to have less, you know, vocabulary and less of that oral language in terms of listening and speaking skills. Okay, so when we look at language, basically it can be broken down into these 6 key components. So there's going to be phonology. And so phonology is just the study of the sound system of language. And that includes phonemes and graphemes. Okay, so phonemes are the sounds, like the units of sounds, and then the graphemes are going to be the individual letters. So they've got, you know, different ways to think about them. And so when we think of, when we look at a word, okay, so for example, the word 6, it has 3 graphemes, right? There's 3 letters in there. So we have S, I, and X. And then we actually have 4 phonemes, okay? And the X always gave me a hard time. Like when I first started learning about this, I was like, 6, it's only got 3, right? How can something that has 3 letters have 4 sounds, right? But when you listen to it, right, it's S, I, S, right? So the X is actually 2 sounds, right? 2 sounds that are making it up. So it's got 2 phonemes to it. And if you go through your alphabet, you're going to find that you have some letters that may have more than 1 sound, right? So for example, we have here, when we look at the word spoon, right? When we're teaching the little ones, you know, they're not going to be having words that they can actually read, right? Or letters that they may not even understand, right? But we can start with those sounds. So for example, in the word spoon, right, you've got spoon, right? Those are the phonemes. And then when I look at the graphemes, right, if you'll notice they kind of broke down the graphemes here. So I've got the S, I've got the P, and the O together are what's making that oo, right? And then you have the N. But then when I spell the word out, right, I've actually got 5 letters. So, you know, there's just a whole bunch of different ways that we can think of language. Okay, so again, if these are some things that you're like, I'm not sure about, jot them down so you can take a look at them a little bit further. Okay, so the second component is going to be morphology. And so morphology is just the study of the structure of words as well as word formations. And when we think of morphology, it's going to be referring to morphemes. And so morpheme is just the smallest meaningful unit in a language. So when I take a word, right, I can break a word down, right, take off, you know, prefixes, I can take off suffixes. In some cases, I just have a word and I can actually take off a piece of that word and I can still get a meaning. And so in this case here, right, I've actually got two morphemes. So that pre means something, right, like before, and then school is going to be that like root word. So that pre means before. So preschool is like, you know, where kids go before they go to like actual school, right, or elementary school. So this is really important to also teach your students because it's going to help them to be able to decode language, right? Whenever they're reading something, it'll help them to give them those decoding skills. Okay, the next thing is going to be syntax, and this is just the arrangement of words and phrases in language. And so when we think about, so all of these things we've talked about right now, the students in EC6, right, in elementary school, they should have been starting to pick up these things, but it's, you know, in fourth grade, your students are starting to read, like, it's not just like they're learning to read, right? They're starting to actually read. So they're going to be needing these components more just for the decoding part, right? To kind of help them so that they can be more proficient learners and more proficient readers. And so when it comes to syntax, right, your students may have seen simple sentences, but as they get into, you know, 8th grade, they're going to start to be seeing more complex sentences, right? And you'll start to be using, you know, what are those things like conjunctions and all these other, you know, parts, right, to make your sentences more elaborate. Okay, so you know, things to consider for all the way into the 8th grade. When it gets to lexicon, this is just looking at the vocabulary of a language. So, you know, in the English language, you know, number one, it's a confusing language to learn, right? Learn to read, learn to spell and all of that. But we've also got words that have different meanings. So for example, we have present, right? So I gave you a present for your birthday, right? Or you're present today in this review, right? So they have, it's the same word, it's spelled the exact same way, but it has two different meanings. And so we want to make sure that we're also trying to improve our students' vocabulary, because you may have some students who have seen a word and only heard a word in one context, but they haven't heard it in another, right? So just kind of helping them with that so that they are understanding, right, that when they're reading something, right, they may have to think about the lexicon and how it's going to be related to the actual sentence structure or the you know, paragraph or text, whatever that they're reading. Okay, then we've got pragmatics, and this is going to describe the interpretation of communication based on context. So when we think of the English language, right, there are things that we say and it's just like, what's it called? I always forget this term. Like a figure of speech, right? So it's not like literal, you know, like, oh my God, it's raining cats and dogs outside, right? We don't literally mean, right, that there's cats and dogs falling out of the sky, but for someone that is new to the language, that's what they probably are thinking of, right? And they're like, what the heck? Where do you see cats and dogs? You know, like, oh my God, I can't believe they're coming out of the sky. So for our English language learners, pragmatics are going to be something that you definitely want to work on with them so that they do kind of understand that. But that's also something that you may try to, like if you're using them in class, you're explaining it. You know what I mean? Like, so it's not to say that you don't want to use them at all, but you want to make sure that you are explaining what you mean. So for example, I'm not a native Spanish speaker. And so like when my husband tells me jokes, you know, like he'll try to tell me jokes in Spanish. And I'm like, yeah, I didn't get that. Like way over my head, you know, because for me, I do a literal translation. And so I don't, you know, so he has to explain the whole thing, which of course kills the joke. So I'm like, just don't even bother. Like, I'm not going to get them. So then we have semantics, and then this is how meaning is conveyed through language, through the use of different words, right? So I can say the same thing, but I can say it a whole bunch of different ways, right? So there's not just one way to say something. Okay. And then we've also got connotation and denotation. Okay, so connotation is just the implied meaning of words and ideas. And so culture can play a role or a knowledge of the language. And so again, with this, non-native speakers may have difficulty understanding it. And then denotation is the literal meaning of words and ideas. Okay, so again, when I'm talking about, you know, the jokes that my husband tells me in Spanish, right? I always go to the literal meaning, but I don't understand what else he is referring to, okay? So that's, again, something that your students that are English language learners, you have to take into consideration and really, you know, spell it out for them, right? This is what I'm saying, you know, but this is what I really mean, okay? All right, and so with all of those things, like with all 6 of those, what we want to make sure that we're doing, and I noticed in all of the competencies that we're going over today, there was a component in all of them and all of the descriptors that talks about explicit systematic instruction. Okay, and so this is something that's also very big that you're going to be seeing on the Science of Teaching and Reading exam, is explicit systematic instruction. So they don't want you, telling your students and just having them guess, right? Like, oh, well, I'm doing this, and you're not giving any sort of explanation. So it's really being purposeful and explaining it like to the fullest to your students so that they have a very clear understanding, and there's no room, right, for ideas that are not correct or for students to misunderstand something. Like it's out there. And so with explicit systematic instruction, students are clearly told what to do and why, and the provided instruction based on their needs and assessments. So I'm not just gonna, do these one size fits all things, right? And I don't wanna, I wanna make sure that I'm constantly assessing my students to see where they're at, right? And also to see that they're actually understanding whatever it is that I'm teaching. Okay, and so this is a video kind of explaining, I think she does a really good job of explaining what this explicit systematic instruction is. Okay, and so she's referring to it as the I do. And in class, we've talked about the I do, we do, you do, right? So when in the I do, that's the explicit systematic instruction part. You are going to have some we do, you're going to have some you do, right? But when we talk about explicit systematic, we want to make sure that that I do is very, very clear. Okay, and she's going to give you some tips on how to do that.
The most important part of any lesson, whether it's reading, writing, math, or any lesson, is that the teacher provides explicit instruction of the skill. We all throw around that term explicit instruction in our PDs and PLCs, but what really makes a lesson explicit or not? When we introduce a new skill and show students models, exemplars, examples, then we are showing them what a good one looks like. But showing models isn't teaching, and it's definitely not explicit. All we're doing is providing kids a couple isolated examples, which doesn't mean they can automatically just do the skill. Consequently, many of us then go into a mode of demonstration. We say, let me show you. And we stand in front of the kids and do one while they watch. Both of these examples of models showing a model the noun, and demonstrating a model the verb, are essential in strong instruction, but they are not what make a lesson explicit. We need to make sure we teach students how to do, what to do, when to do it, where to do it, why we do it. All of these thoughts are the explicit nature of instruction. If we really want to teach ourselves out of a job, meaning the kids can independently execute the skill we're trying to teach, then we must share our journey of thinking. An explicit lesson includes a teacher-only, one-person monologue. It's where you caption every thought you have while you're demonstrating the skill. You talk to yourself out loud. You pause, you interrupt yourself, you question, you make decisions. You are, from beginning to end, going to demonstrate a skill and share every individual thought you had along the way. Although many of us show an example and even demonstrate an example in front of students, what's going to make it explicit is when we think aloud while we're demonstrating that model. Explicit instruction is more than just I do, you watch. When we add in the think aloud, it now becomes I do, you watch, and listen. To ensure you're providing think alouds, apply these tips. Tell your students that in every lesson you teach, there's going to be an I do portion. This means I'm going to do the work. I want you just to watch and listen. In other words, don't raise your hands. In fact, if during the I do, kids have their hands up and they're trying to answer your rhetorical questions, then just look at them and say, put your hand down. This is my show. Here's why. I'm not doing the think aloud for the 3 or 4 kids who already know how to do it. I'm doing it for the other 24 who have no idea how to execute this skill. Another way to reinforce that this is a one-person monologue, that this is my show, is don't actually make eye contact with the students when you're demonstrating and thinking aloud. Rather, look up, look to the side, look beyond, look through the students, but don't actually look directly at them. Avoid looking at the students and avoid talking to them directly. In other words, all your think alouds should be first person. I, me, my. Those are the statements we should be using. Rather than questioning, what could you do next? Better would be, what could I do next? Another tip is to plan your I, me, or my statements ahead of time. In other words, don't plan to wing a think aloud in the middle of a mini lesson. The skill that you're trying to teach is so automatic to you. It's ingrained. You know how to do it and don't even know how you know how. You have to stop, pre-plan, and write out your I statements. When planning these I, me, or my statements, fall back on a common set of sentence starters. Using I'm wondering, or maybe this has me thinking that, I see and think, so I'm going to, what if? These cards guide you to share the journey of your thinking. And if you incorporate them into your lesson, if you actually hold them up during the think aloud and you're sharing your monologue with students, the cards also remind the students that this is the part of the lesson where I do, you watch and listen.
Okay, so real good. I thought that was a very clear explanation as to what we really mean by explicit systematic instruction. Okay, so moving on with oral language, when we learn about oral language, we also have to understand that there are stages of that first language development. And so even 4 through 8 has to understand what those stages are. So babies are going to start with that babbling, right? You're going to start hearing babies making sounds, right, at 3 to 5 months. And that's actually those first stages of speech. Okay, so that is, sometimes when you take your baby to the doctor, they're going to ask you if your babies are actually doing that, right? Because that's showing that they're meeting those milestones. Then at 6 to 10 months, you'll have your babies probably start saying one word, and it's repetitive, right? So a baby may be saying ma, 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 right? And so you're thinking, oh, the baby said mama, right? That's 2 syllables, but maybe they just said ma twice, right? So they'll starting with those 1 words, and then they'll reach the 2-word stage 12 to 18 months. Telegraphic stage is 24 to 30 months. That's where they're going to start to get that sentence structure. So it's not just, me milk, right? But it's like, I want the milk or something, right? So they start actually making sentences. And then at 30 plus months is where they're going to start to reach that multi-word stage, and they're going to start showing that they are understanding grammar and the language is functional, right? So it's actually making more sense. When it comes to speaking, listening, and reading, we need to understand that all of these are important for language acquisition, but a lot of times listening is overlooked in the classroom, right? If you think about it, we're going to be having students, we want them to practice reading, right? We want them to practice speaking, but we always forget about that listening part. And so when it comes to English language arts, we need to make sure that that component is always in there. And it's gonna, we want to make sure that we incorporate activities that are going to allow us to have students practice that. So practice that oral communication. So some examples of things that you could do would be like role playing. So, you could have them, let's go ahead and act out, like this story that we just read. And that helps them to practice the language, right? How things should actually sound, not just like, reading it, like a robot or something, right? But if you actually do that, it's going to help them with understanding the oral language, which in turn is going to help them to be better readers. You could have language plays, so using rhymes or songs or tongue twisters, and you'll notice in the elementary they do that a lot, right? So there's a lot of songs and rhyming and just trying to make it fun. But again, the whole purpose is just to work on the language. You can have students turn and talk in small groups, right? Frequent small group purposeful talk, interviewing each other or doing presentations. So of course, as the students get older, that's where you'll be able to do those presentations. In like maybe 4th grade or 5th grade, presentations might be like show and tell, right? So they're just bringing something and, just talking about it in front of the class. But dramatic play role playing can happen all the way up in 8th grade. I've seen it happen all the way in like high school. Okay, so don't think that any of these are just strictly for, the little ones. These can be done in all of those grade levels.
Think about how much reading you do in a day. You read the newspaper, emails, street signs, and directions. Reading is critical to academic success, economic opportunities, and quality of life. Alarmingly, research has demonstrated that a first grader who is a poor reader at the end of the school year has an 88% chance of remaining a poor reader at the end of 4th grade. Subsequently, there is a 74% probability of a poor reader at the end of 4th grade remaining a poor reader throughout his or her academic career. That's why your role is so vital. You will help young learners get on the road to reading success. Welcome, my name is Vanessa. In 3 videos, you'll learn about 3 foundational literacy skills: oral language, phonological awareness, and letter recognition. Before we begin, make sure that you have downloaded the handout. Let's begin. There are 2 components of reading: decoding and language comprehension. Decoding is translating symbols on a page into words. In other words, to be skilled readers, students need to instantly recognize words. Language comprehension, which we'll refer to as oral language, is the focus of this video. Oral language is understanding language at a listening and speaking level. Now I'm going to introduce a few activities for developing oral language. The first activity is naming. Naming involves your students naming items related to different topics and categories. By naming items and categories, you help the students organize their language for better retrieval. You might have your students name fruits. For example, have them name fruits that are red, fruits that are green, and fruits that are yellow. Your students could name fruits that are big and round, and fruits that are small and round. You want to keep the naming brisk. If your students can't name many items in a category, you name some items and have them repeat as many as they can remember. Choose a topic for naming that coordinates with the book you're reading with your students.
Let's name some berries.
Raspberry, blueberry, boysenberry.
Good job. Let's name some melons.
Watermelon, cantaloupe,
Honeydew?
honeydew, yeah.
I'm going to say a sentence and I want you to repeat it after me. An apple is red and a plum is purple.
An apple is red and a plum is purple.
Good. Now you try a sentence.
An orange is orange and an apple is red.
Good job.
Another activity that builds oral language is dialogic reading. Dialogic reading means that as you read to a student, you want to have discussions or dialogues with him or her. You do this by asking your students simple questions and by adding information to their responses. You can use dialogic reading as you read books with your students. Dialogic reading looks like this.
Do you know what this book is about?
A bug.
A bug? Yeah, actually a caterpillar. Have you ever heard of a caterpillar?
Mm-hmm.
What is it?
It's a bug that's hairy,
You're right, it's hairy and it's really long.
and it has 6 feet and 12 eyes.
Well, based on what you know about insects, what do you think this caterpillar might eat?
Leaves.
Maybe some leaves? So he might see other things other than leaves that he wants to eat. What else do you think he might eat besides leaves?
Berries.
Maybe some berries too. So what do you think this story is about, or what did you learn about it?
It's hairy, it's long, it has 6 legs and 12 eyes.
All right, good job.
Yes, success. Here's a mnemonic to help you remember the steps. Peer, P-E-E-R. P is for prompt. E is for evaluate. The second E is for extend. R is for repeat. Students in the early grades need a strong oral language base so they can understand the words they are reading. In short, the value of oral language development is priceless.
Okay, and so she did mention some other videos in there. So I'm gonna see if I can find those so I can just put them in that Nearpod for you to access. All right, so when
Sorry, I have a
Go ahead.
question. I'm so
Uh-huh.
sorry. What was the first E? She said prompt, and then what was the first E? Did anyone catch it?
I think it was evaluate.
Thank you very much.
Mhm. Okay, and so in the review, right, we'll talk about different types of strategies just because again, we'll take a look at your competencies in a little bit in your descriptors, and a lot of them talk about strategies that you do have to know, okay? So when we talk about oral language, again, when we look at how oral and written language are connected, they have a really strong connection. So we have to make sure that we're working on our students' oral language to make sure that they're going to be better readers, and that's also going to cause them to be better writers, right? So if they have a rich vocabulary and if they have a lot of experience in talking, right, in different contexts, then they're also going to be able to put that down on paper, right? So they'll be able to have a strong written communication. So something that does happen, right, is that oral language is usually really informal. You know, when we talk to our students in class, when we're teaching, right, a lot of times that's very informal. And so we want to try to make sure that we encourage our students to use formal language when they're actually writing, okay? And so again, I remember when all this, the cell phones came out and texting started happening, right? We started getting students, and, you know, I worked in the high school, we started getting students that were writing the way they would text, you know, so like they weren't even writing out the full words, right? So instead of writing the word you, Y-O-U, they were literally writing the U, right? The letter U. So that was something that we had to work on. And I think I kind of saw that kind of go away, and students started going back to, you know, writing the way that they should be writing. Okay, so something we want to also do with oral language is we want to make sure that we are assessing it, right? So we want to assess that speaking that students are doing. And this can be done very informally by just listening to them, right? So just listening to those conversations, trying to engage all of your students in conversations. And I know in the virtual world right now, it's difficult, right? Because a lot of kids have their cameras off, right? But this is something that you want to try to do. Even your quiet kids, you want to try to get them talking. So asking questions obviously is a good way to do that. Now, before you jump to conclusions, right, and say, oh my gosh, this student must have a developmental issue or they have a disorder, right? They need to get tested for something. There are some things that you want to consider, such as dialects of English, right? So here in El Paso, if you've lived here your whole life, right, you may only know this, right? But if you go to other parts of the country or even other parts of the world, there are different dialects of English. And so because of that, pronunciation is going to be different, words are going to be different. And so you have to first, you know, find out if is the student a transfer, you know, coming in from somewhere else, then maybe it's not a disorder that they have, maybe it's just their dialect. When you look at first languages such as Spanish, Chinese, Korean, or even Japanese, there's actually certain letters and certain sounds that they don't use in the language, right? And so when they come here and you're teaching them English, those sounds or letters just weren't in their language before. And so it's difficult for them to do, okay? So I think, for example, like the letter R is not something that you'll see like in Chinese. And so that's why they have a difficulty, pronouncing that letter R. If you think of like in Spanish, a lot of times when you hear words in Spanish that have like an S, there's usually a letter E in front of it, right? And so because of that, when students are learning English, whenever there's a word that begins with an S, they put that E in front of it, right? Spaghetti, right? Instead of spaghetti, because in Spanish, that's just the way that language is built, right? So there's always typically going to be an E in front of the S's. And then culture, of course, is going to be another thing to consider. In some cultures, right, students are the children are meant to be quiet, right? They don't speak, they don't talk, they don't look you in the eye, right? And so those may be things that you want to consider before jumping to any disorders. Now, TALPAS is going to be an assessment that is used in the state of Texas, and it is given to all ELLs, and it's an assessment that's testing their listening, speaking, reading, and writing skills. And it's given like the moment they come into the schools and they're coded in ELL, so an English language learner, they're going to be given that test, and they're going to be given that test every year. So a student may come in kindergarten and be considered an ELL, and they'll be given this test until they score an advanced high, meaning that they've mastered the language in all 4 components. So listening, speaking, reading, and writing. If a student doesn't master it, and even if they're like in the highs in listening, speaking, reading, and writing, they may end up taking that test all the way until 12th grade. Okay, so we have, there are cases where students come in, their first school was here, but they never fully master the language. And so they just continue taking the assessment. But once they master it, then they'll be, then they're like tested out, I guess you could say. There are some students who are able to test out of one thing versus another. Maybe they have really good listening skills. So they get advanced high in listening. So, the following year, they'll just have to test in speaking, reading, and writing. So it's literally 4 different tests. Okay, now some disorders that students may have when it comes to oral language, some voice disorders that can happen would be phonation and resonance. And so with phonation disorders, that's an abnormality with the vibration of the vocal cords. And so if students have a very hoarse like talk, or if they have a lot of breathiness, right, when they're talking, it's going to interfere with that comprehension. And then another thing would also be resonance, right? So resonance disorders happens when there are abnormalities with the sound passing through the vocal tract. And so an example would be hypernasality, and that's when the sound passing through the nasal cavity causes oral sounds to be nasal, right? So it sounds like they're talking from their nose, like right up here, right? And that's gonna lead to the speaking being a little bit different, right? Okay, some fluency disorders that can happen. And when we're talking about these disorders, this is something that's gonna affect the child's ability to produce coherent and fluent communication. So stuttering is something that students may have difficulty with. And this would be, you'll have false starts or the inability to produce intended sounds. And then cluttering is something that can also happen. So that's when children try to communicate excessively fast, and it makes comprehension difficult, right? They're just like just blurting everything out, and you're like, what? You can't understand anything that they're saying. So something to note here, you want to make sure that you don't confuse these disorders with your ELLs, right? That are just starting to acquire the language. Because students that are just starting to acquire the language, right, they may start to say a word and stop themselves because they're correcting it, right? So then it may take them a while to get the word out, but it's not that they have a stuttering issue, it's that they're learning the language, okay? And so just, again, keeping that in mind, that before we jump to there's a disorder, we always have to first consider, are they an ELL? Another one could be articulation problems. And so the most common one is lisping. And this is going to happen when individuals produce the S or the S or sh or z or ch sound, right, with their tongue between their upper and lower teeth, okay? So I had a student one year who I was in the high school, And he was a freshman when I had him, and I had him later as a senior. And he told me, and he sounded different. He had a lisp as a freshman. He didn't have it as a senior. And he was like, he's all, yes, my dad used to call me Daffy Duck, right? He called me Daffy Duck my whole life, and I never understood why. And as a sophomore or a junior, a teacher brought it to his attention and was like, oh man, like, you did you know you have a lisp? And he's like, what? Like, he had no clue. He had no clue that he had a lisp. And so once the teacher pointed it out, he asked his parents, and they're like, oh yeah, you've had it your whole life. And he was like, why didn't you ever tell me? Like, I would have worked on it to correct it. Like, I didn't even know I was speaking wrong. And so by the time I got him as a senior, he had corrected his lisp and he no longer had it. So it was just something that he had to be made aware of. So that is something that, people can have all the way into adulthood. Then another thing would be when students are having difficulty pronouncing. So when kids are really young, they have difficulty pronouncing the w, and sounds, right? So like my son, for example, he's 5, he, instead of saying he says right? That's how he does it. So we're still working on that with him. But these are not, it's not like he has a speech, disability or anything. But when they're really young, it's just developmental, right? They're still learning how to do that. And in the lower grades in elementary, when it comes to speech, you literally want to be teaching it like having a mirror, right? And looking at my mouth. How is my mouth? Where do my teeth look like? How open is my mouth? To help students be able to do that as they are working with the oral language, okay? But obviously in 4th through 8, they should have already kind of worked on that. So if students are still having difficulty pronouncing these letters and they're older, right? Like, let's say you have a student in like 6th or 7th grade, right? And they're having difficulty pronouncing these, then maybe that's a situation where the student may need some speech therapy. Okay, so that could be a problem that they do have. Okay, now when it comes to technology, all of your standards are also mentioning technology that should be used for each of the different components that we're looking at. So when it comes to oral language, there's actually apps that you can get on your phone. I know one of my colleagues at work, he had an app that was to make raps. So basically you could say something into the app and then it would turn it into a rap, okay? So like he would he would stand at the door and he'd say things like thanks for being on time, right? And he'd be playing it, like, so as the kids are walking in, they're listening to him rapping, thanks for being on time, right? So he would do little things like that, but you can do stuff like that with your students. And that's just, again, a way to encourage them to practice that oral language. You can have students you can have them record videos, right? Or even just record themselves saying things. Like if you've had, what is that app? Oh my gosh, I forgot it. We've used it in class where you can record yourself saying something. You can record yourself doing a video.
Flipgrid?
Flipgrid, there we go. Yes, I could not think of it. So with something like Flipgrid, it's actually recording the students, not only their voice, but also like themselves. So they can also work on, what they should be doing when giving a speech, right? So what they should look like, they're able to hear it as well. And then you can also have videos that you can play for students. So instead of like reading a book to them, you can actually watch a video and then have a discussion about it afterwards, just to gauge their listening comprehension. There's even apps out there that can be used for storytelling. So students can use the apps to tell stories themselves. And then of course, ebooks, right? Ebooks are out there like crazy. So with the ebooks, you can use them again to read them to the students or have students read, and then of course have a discussion, right? So with the technologies, there's always this, speaking and listening component. Okay, so before we get to the quiz, if you can go ahead and take a look at the preparation manual. So go ahead and take a look at your preparation manual. And I'd like for you to go ahead and read through the competencies, the descriptors that you have there just for competency 1. And if there's anything, right, obviously I'm not going over like every single little detail, but if there's anything in there that you need to take a look at further, you want to go ahead and jot it down. And then I'm going to go ahead and put you all into breakout rooms for about 5 minutes, just so you can go ahead and discuss, ask any questions that you might have. And see if there's anything here that we have not covered. And I know there were a couple of things that we didn't quite cover like very fully. All right, so I'm going to give you 5 minutes to go ahead and discuss with your group. So next we have competency 2, and this is looking at early literacy development. And so even though some of you are only doing 4 through 8, you may be thinking, why do I need to know about early literacy? I'm not even teaching that, but it is important that you do understand it. So with early literacy, we want to remember that phonemic and phonological awareness are the foundation for the development of language. Okay, so these are super, super important. And so students and children, right, they need to have phonemic and phonological awareness in order to become good readers. So I can't go straight to reading text, right, unless my students actually understand how words and word parts and sounds are put together to make words. Okay, so I have to first start with the things that they have to think and speak before I can actually start connecting that to text. Okay. And so students will need to break down words into sounds as well as put sounds together to make words, right? And that's going to be super useful when it comes to reading. So if they don't understand how that works, then they're not going to be able to jump straight to reading. And this is also going to be a tool that's going to help students be good at spelling. Okay, so it's going to help all of that. So if I skip the phonemic and phonological awareness, then my students are going to have a really hard time reading. It's going to be a struggle for them as well as writing. And so when it comes to phonological awareness, this is just referring to the ability to recognize and manipulate components of the sound system and structure of words, right? So really looking at words and breaking them down into word parts or into the individual sounds that make them. And so examples could include segmenting words into syllables, manipulating words into sentences, as well as identifying lexical stress of words. So for example, if I have, if I have the word stop, right, I could break that down into syllables. Well, there's only one syllable, right? Stop. I could break that down into phonemes. So I could have stop, right? Break down that way. I could break it down into onset and rhyme. So it's stop. Right? So it's the first part, the first sound and the rest of the word. Okay. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can break words apart as well as put them together. And we need to make sure that we teach students that. So with phonemic awareness, that's the ability to understand that words are made up of smaller components called phonemes, right? And we just mentioned that one right now. So those are the individual sounds that are found in the words. And then syllabication is that ability to break things down into syllables. So in pre-K, for example, they start working with students learning how to find the number of syllables, right, in words, and they start working on the sounds that individual letters make. And then as they get to kinder, right, they're going to gradually progress through that. And so students have to like that has to be, worked on in the early grades. So that way, as they start reading, they've already got that basis to work on. So then when we talk about lexical stress, this is going to be used in the pronunciation of words. So geography has stress on the second syllable, right? And then again, when we think to students or ELL learners coming from Spanish, right? In Spanish, there's always, the syllable's always going to be, sorry, not the syllable. The stress is always going to be found on the same syllable, right? Unless they have that accent on it, okay? So that's just common to that language. But in English, right, that it doesn't necessarily mean that the stress is always on the same syllable, okay? And then we have phonemic stress. So that's going to be used to change the meaning of a word. So again, I could say present or I could say present, right? So when we have words, again, in the English language, depending on how we say them, they're also going to have different meanings. Or we could have sentence stress, or another way to say that would be intonation patterns. And that's just changing how we're stressing words in a sentence. So I could say, how are you? Or I could say, how are you, right? And it's going to mean two different things. Okay, then we have alliteration. And alliteration is something that you're going to be using that students should be able to identify. And it's also something that students will be able to practice. But it's just a way to emphasize phonemes by using successive words with the same consonant, sound, or letter, right? So tongue twisters are examples of those. And again, it's just getting students to practice that language, right? As well as identifying those individual sounds. So for example, right, we've got our Sally sells seashells by the seashore, okay? You've got Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, right? Another tongue twister there. And then when it comes to this sequence of how it should be taught, we need to start by working with rhymes. So that's why you're going to see in the elementary, there's a lot of rhyming that's happening. So students should be able to recognize rhymes, what's rhyming, and it's helping them to, listen to those sounds and hear how they sound similar. Students should then be able to identify syllables. Then they should do onset and rhyme. So that's like the first part of the word with the whole second part of the word. Initial sounds of words, then blending sounds to make words, then segmenting. So breaking it down. So one is like putting the sounds together, the other one is breaking them down, and then the other one would be manipulating sounds to make new words. So the seventh one is going to be the most challenging for students to do. And again, students should be able to do all of these. Okay, so if they're able to do all of these, again, we're just setting them on the path to be good readers, which in turn will cause them to be good learners. Okay. So this is also something that will be mentioned a little bit on the Science of Teaching and Reading exam. And so we need to make sure that students understand how, well, not students, but us as teachers, that we understand the order that we should be teaching these in. And so we can't just go jumping from, if I haven't done any of this, I can't just give a student CAT and ask them to read the word, right? Because they're still, if they don't understand how sounds are actually blended together, they're not going to be able to make a word out of it. So for example, my son, right, when he started kindergarten, I gave him a word, right? I was trying to read with him over the summer and, did not know this information because I went through a big training over the summer, but I was like, come on, baby, like, I know you can sound this out. And he was like, act, like, that's it. And I was like, what's the word? He's like, I don't know, right? It made no sense to him because he still didn't understand how sounds make words, right? He was just seeing letters on a paper, right? And he's like, just tell me what it says. I don't understand. So he wasn't able to make those connections. Okay, now when it comes to the alphabetic principle, there are going to be different stages that students are going to go through, right? Or kids in general are going to go through. So there's the pre-alphabetic stage. And so children in preschool are going to be able to see letters or pictures, right? Logos, and they're going to know that they mean something. So, I'm sure if any of you have kids, right? The kids know the arches, right? They know what the arches are. My son learned those right away, he knows what Walmart looks like. He knows what Target looks like. He knows what all of those buildings are. He knows Whataburger, of course. And then they're going to get to that partial alphabetic stage. So that's when they're going to start to connect the shapes of letters with their sound and connect initial letters with names. So at that stage, right, for example, my son, he knows his name is Max. And so he knows that his name begins with an M. So anytime he would see anything, right, when he was at the stage, anytime he saw anything that had an M, he would say, oh, that says Max. Oh, that says Max, right? Like he was able to see that connection, right? With the M means Max. But he could care less about the rest of the letters in the word, right? And so as he started learning, to read, that's something that students will also start to do is if they don't want to, if they don't want to sound it out, they'll just guess, right? There's the first letter is this. So a word that begins with that is Max, right? So they're just going to guess, like they're not even trying to sound that out. So again, that's something we got to practice with the students. Then when they reach the full alphabetic stage, that's where they're going to be able to connect the letters with the sounds and meaning, right? So it's showing that whole progression of that understanding. But again, if we don't start with that phonological and phonemic awareness, then they're going to be missing some of these components here, right? So the sounds are super important in the partial and in that full alphabetic stage. Okay. So then we have grapheme and phoneme connection. And so when we hear the term grapheme, that's going to be referring to the letters, and then the phoneme is going to be referring to the sounds. So when we are teaching this with our students, there's actually certain letters that you should start teaching first before you teach other letters. And it's going to be the ones that they're going to see more frequently. So the letters that you would want to teach first with that grapheme and phoneme connection are going to be M, A, T, S, P, and H, right? Those are the ones we actually want to start with. And with just those letters, you can make a whole bunch of words, right? Even nonsense words, words that don't make sense. But that would be a way to help students make those connections. And then when you begin that graphophonemic relationship, you want to make sure that you're using sounds that have the least confusion, right? So I don't want to use like M and N because when I'm saying them, they may sound the same, right? To a student that's listening to me, they may sound the same. The same as S or R, right? F, S, and R. Those can be kind of difficult to for students to understand like exactly what you're saying. And then you're going to start by introducing one or two consonants and short vowels, such as in the word cat, right? So I'm not going to start with a big word. I'm going to start with something really small and something that only has one syllable. And then you'll start to add consonant blends. So a blend would be when I have two letters together, right? And the two letters together make a certain sound. And then I'll start to blend in, start to use digraphs. So that's when I have two letters making a completely different sound. So we've got SH there and CH. And then I want to make sure that I begin with letter sounds that blend easily and avoid using voiceless stop sounds. So a T, a P, and a K, like it's going to stop, right? It's going to stop the sound. So for example, if I said, I don't know, if I said Sam, right? When I'm like sounding out the word, right? I could say Sam, right? And we could blend that like easily so students understand how that works. But if I were to put a T in there, right, it'd be like sat, right? And it stops it. So that's what we mean with that one. We want to try to start by using words that actually blend together, right? Letters that are going to blend to help students understand. Okay, now when it comes to types of writing systems, the most commonly known writing systems out there in the world, right, are going to be logographic writing, syllabic writing, and then alphabetic writing. And so the English language as well as Spanish are going to be alphabetic. So that means that we have like a single letter representing a single sound, I guess you could say. And so with logographic writing, that's going to represent words and ideas with visual or graphic symbols. So like, for example, in Chinese, like one symbol actually means a whole word. Okay, so it's not like they don't spell out the word, it's the symbol means the word. And that's why the Chinese language is really hard to learn because there's so many symbols out there, right? Then you have syllabic writing, and this is going to use symbols to represent syllables. So in this example here, right, you'll notice that each symbol is representing a syllable. So it's not just a letter, it's not a word, right? It's the syllable. So you put them together to make your words. And then in alphabetic writing, we have our 26 letters, right? And then they've all got their different sounds, and that's how we make all of our words. Okay, so let me see where we at. I think we're good.
Hi, and welcome back to Family Phonics. In this video, I'll be introducing graphemes. In the last video, we introduced phonemes, the smallest sounds that can change a word's meaning. In this video, we introduce graphemes as a way of recording sounds in writing and print. The letter or group of letters that represents a phoneme is called its grapheme. Children often begin by noticing graphemes that are common, useful, or meaningful to them, such as the letters representing the first sound in their name. A few of the most common phoneme-grapheme pairs in English are s, e, t, p, I, and n. Learning which grapheme goes with which phoneme is a multisensory learning experience for your child. They will see the grapheme and hear the phoneme. You can enrich this learning further by adding actions, rhymes and songs, and physical resources. Making practice active and playful helps children to make stronger connections in their learning. Some phonemes are easier to match with their grapheme than others. There are 47 phonemes in the English language and only 26 letters, so sometimes we need to use a group of letters to represent a single phoneme. Here's the grapheme that commonly represents sh. It has 2 letters but only represents one phoneme. We call graphemes with 2 letters a digraph, and there are lots of those in English. Here's a grapheme that can represent the I sound in night. This one has 3 letters. It's called a trigraph. When your child begins learning phonics, they'll learn the most common ways that each phoneme can be represented. Of course, there are often many ways of representing the same phoneme. Letters on paper are not intended to represent only sound. They are words with meaning. And phonics is not the only tool your child will need to learn in order to learn to spell. So, if it can lead to spelling mistakes, why is phonics an important strategy for my child to learn? Let's have a look at the traditional see and say approach to learning to read. If I learn to recognize the words pin and set, then I can write the words pin and set. If, however, I learn to recognize the graphemes for the phonemes s, e, t, p, I, and n, then I can write a whole lot more. Phonics speeds up the very early stages of reading and gives children the confidence to try new words as they build their early reading and writing skills. In this video, we've seen that a grapheme can be a single letter or a group of letters that represents a phoneme. In the next section of our course, you'll learn some practical ways you can help your child build up the connections between phonemes and graphemes.
Okay, so with English, because it is a confusing language, right? And it comes to when it comes to grapheme phoneme correspondence, just like she mentioned, right? We have 26 graphemes, but there's actually 44 phonemes. And so that can be challenging for students. And then we have consonants that are going to be pretty consistent, but our vowels, actually our 5 vowels that we have, right, are actually going to represent 14 different vowel sounds, including diphthongs. So something that I have seen in my son's school, right, so he's in kindergarten right now, is that they play these videos for them that just goes over all the different sounds that the letters can make. And the videos, they have like, it's like a little rhyme. And then they also have some sort of like hand movement that goes with it, just to kind of get that kinesthetic, learning going on in there, so that students are starting to learn those things. So that way, as they progress to reading, right, in 1st grade, he's going to remember all those things because they play it every single day in his classroom. Okay, now some other areas that may be difficult, right, are that certain sounds may sound similar. And then we have different graphemes that are going to actually represent the same sounds. So we have the S, which can sound like a Z or a sh or a s, right? It's got all these different sounds that it can actually make on its own. And then we have some graphemes that are actually silent, as well as multiple vowel and consonant digraphs representing another sound, right? So if I have like an O and a U together, right, I get a different sound than just an O and a U by themselves. And then when we use contractions in our daily speaking and listening, that's also going to lead to problems with the students. So something that was mentioned in one of the texts I was looking through was it said to try to avoid using contractions, like with the students, like in the early grades, just to help them with that understanding that, you know, oral language, as well as that phonemic and phonological awareness. Okay, and then when it comes to looking at consonant clusters that begin with an S, that's going to have them blend those sounds, right? But when we see them in Spanish, right, like I mentioned, when you have something that begins with an S, it's typically going to be preceded by an E in Spanish. So you're going to have those ELLs trying to put an E in front of words that begin with an S. And then many words that end in consonant clusters can be challenging for students to blend. So that can cause them to simplify them. So like early, right, students that are early speakers, they may just kind of drop off the ending of a word. They're only going to use the beginning of it just because it's hard for them to say. Now, there are different reading development stages, and these are their actual names for them. So when you have an emergent reader, that's someone that is understanding that print contains information that's meaningful. So those are going to be in the really early grades. And then you have your early readers, or they are sometimes referred to as progressing readers. So those ones are beginning to read simple text with some success, right? And they're developing a list of high frequency words, which are also referred to as sight words. And they're going to be relying more on picture clues. So like my son, for example, in kindergarten, he's an early reader. Okay, so he's barely starting to do that, but he does still rely on those pictures for the clues. And then you're going to have newly fluent readers or transitional readers. And these students are reading with relative fluency and comprehension, but they can use other cueing systems such as, you know, context clues and other things like that to kind of help them understand. Now, with students, what you're going to have are assessments that are going to be given to them to screen, you know, where it is that they're reading. So they're typically going to give these at the beginning of the school year, and it's just a way to determine if a student's at risk of struggling to read. Because just like we saw in one of those earlier videos, they mentioned that if a student is a struggling reader in 4th grade, right, then they're going to be a struggler for the rest of the, you know, the rest of possibly their life. So that's something that they want to try to catch early on. So with screening assessments, they give them to students, and it just checks to see if they have any of those indicators that show that they may, you know, not be set up for success, so that they can start to help them and give them the help that they need, you know, as the year progresses. And with these assessments, they're not going to diagnose anything. So for example, I think in kindergarten, I want to say it's in kindergarten now, the state of Texas is requiring that all kids in kindergarten have to take a dyslexia screener. And so this is not saying that they have dyslexia, it's just saying that they are showing signs of those things that students that end up getting diagnosed with dyslexia might actually have. Okay, so that's what we mean by a screener. So it's not saying they have anything, it's just saying, wait a minute, there's some of these clues here that we're finding. Then there's going to be diagnostic assessments that it be given, and these are going to be used to assess specific skills or components of reading that you're looking for. So with these ones, there's going to be 2 different types. So there's norm referenced and criterion referenced. So with norm referenced, that's going to be formal, right? Both of these are formal, and it's going to compare student scores to a defined population. So it may say, okay, well, all students in the 4th grade, right, should be reading, I don't know, 70 words per minute, right? I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but all students at this grade should be reading this many words per minute. You actually have a student read, and you assess them, and then you see that the student is only reading, I don't know, 50 words a minute. So you're saying, oh, okay, well then this student is behind, right? Or maybe the student's reading more than that, then great, the student is ahead. Then you have criterion referenced. So that is comparing the student's skills to a defined set of skills and a criterion for mastery. And again, with this one, it's going to be given to them before and then after they're taught, just to look for growth. So you may have a student that, I don't know, they failed like their STAR exam. And so you're like, okay, we need to pull this student aside for intervention. So now let's go ahead and give them an assessment to see where they're at. Now let's go ahead and provide them the interventions that they need. And then let's go ahead and test them again. And let's see if there's actually shown any growth. So it's just a way to, gauge where you're at. Okay, then there are formal assessments, and with formal assessments, when it comes to English language arts, there's like a whole bunch of different things that you can do. But obviously in the classroom, there's going to be teacher-made tests. There's the state assessments like STAR. Districts will produce their own exams as well. And we want to make sure that we're using a variety of assessments. So you don't only want to use multiple choice tests. You don't only want to do like an oral assessment. You want to try to make sure that you're checking students out in all sorts of different ways, because we're always paying attention to their listening skills, right? Their speaking, their reading, and their writing. So we got to make sure that we're being able to assess them in all of those ways. And you want to make sure that they are aligned with the standards, right, in order to make sure that they are a good assessment. And let me see. Okay, and of course, they're all important for analyzing data, right? So we need to collect data to see where students are at. And so when it comes to assessing students' reading, writing, speaking, and listening skills, this is something that we're doing all the time. It's not just, once a year or once in 9 weeks or even once in 3 weeks. So some other examples of ways that you can assess students would be storytelling. So you could actually have story retelling. You could read a story, or you read a story to them, and then you actually tell you what happened. So when you do that, you're able to assess if the students actually understood. Another thing you could do in the upper grades would be essays. And so when you have students write essays, again, they're able to share with you that that writing component, see how their writing is. And it's also going to allow you to really get a better idea, right, of what students know, instead of just a multiple choice assessment. Okay, and we're going to see a couple of other ways that you can assess students in terms of like reading.
Lucas, we're just going to have a chance to read today the bicycle book. Before we do, though, can you please tell me what your reading goal is?
Fluency.
Fluency. So when you're reading, you're thinking about your fluency. What does that mean if you're becoming a fluent reader?
I can read accurately.
Okay, so you can read all of the words.
And with expression.
Oh, you'll change your voice. Wonderful. And what's another thing you really have to think about?
Understand what I read.
The comprehension. Perfect. Perfect. Wonderful, Lucas. Okay, before we begin, though, this is this part of the book we're going to read. It's a nonfiction book, so we're just going to go right to the middle. We don't have to read the beginning, middle, and end. I'll have you read pages 16 to 18 for me today.
On the road. Before taking off, always look around to see that the road is clear. Keep your eyes and ears open. You should not listen to your headlights while riding. You need to be able to hear the traffic. This will help you become a safe cyclist.
Wonderful reading. Lucas? I can tell you're thinking about fluency, because that was smooth reading and it did sound like talking. And one thing you become a lot better at is paying attention to your punctuation. Now, the only thing I want you to go back to and look at is right here you read, keep your eyes and ears open. You should not listen to your head. Now, can I listen to headlights? Does that make sense?
No, not really.
No, not really. So let's just have a closer look. You're right about the first part. And
Headset.
Headset. So that's just a little correction that you can make. And you did do a backup and reread here to correct. You read the word's actually you. Your didn't sound right. And you did a backup and you corrected that beautifully.
All right, so notice how in that in the video she was collecting data, right? So she was checking to see what if the student was reading for all of those things, and then she also gave the student a purpose for reading. So that's something that you always want to do. So when students are going to read, you tell them why it is that they're reading, what is it you're looking for them to do, or what it is that they should be looking to do. And then when the student did make those mistakes, she did provide him some of those questions, right, to have him think. So like, for example, when he said headset, right, was wrong, she asked him, does that make sense, to say headset? Like, can you, can you hear a headset or what, or headlights or whatever it was? And so he was like, well, no, so by asking students those questions, that's a way that you can help students to learn how to self-assess. So when they're reading and they read something and it doesn't quite make sense, they can, go back and try it out again. Okay, so this is another video, and this is, it'll be in the self-paced Nearpod, so you can take a look at this one later. But same thing with this one. She's assessing the student and his, what is it? I think it's the graphophonemic awareness or relationships. Okay, so next, again, when we think about our English language learners, there is a TELPAS assessment that I mentioned earlier that's going to be measuring your students' ability to read, write, and speak, as well as listen. Students, again, will start to take that in kindergarten. And so because of this, right, based on where your students are going to be leveled, because once a student tests, they're going to tell you, you'll have results as to whether a student is at like a beginning speaking ability. So if you have a speaking ability that's low, then that you want to try to address with your student and have them work on practicing more of that speaking and giving them the tools that they need to be successful with speaking, right? To practice that out. And so we actually have ALPS, and we'll be looking at a link a little bit later. So you can look at the ALPS, and it's actually going to tell you some ways that you can have students practice those skills. So TELPAS gives you results, and then based on that, you use your ALPS to have students practice more of that language in the classroom. All right, so if you click on this link, it's going to take you to your ALPS. So when you click on it and you scroll down, it's going to give you what these ALPS are, and then it's going to give you these proficiency level descriptors. So if a student is a beginner in listening, this is telling you what the students are struggling with. And it has these for all of them, for listening, speaking, reading, and then there should be writing. Okay, so with all of these, when you have a student that is an ELL student, you should have results somewhere, data somewhere that's going to tell you where it is that the students are. And so again, in order for students to test out of TELPAS, they have to be scoring advanced high for all 4 of these, for listening, reading, writing, and speaking. Okay, so let's go ahead and try some more sample questions here. So next up, we have competency 3, and this is word identification skills and reading fluency. So with this one, the teacher understands the importance of word identification skills, including decoding, blending, structural analysis, and sight word vocabulary. Reading fluency and provides many opportunities for students to practice and improve word identification skills and reading fluency. So remember, we just talked about that phonological and phonemic awareness, right? Those early literacy skills, and how that is going to be tied to this. So if students are able to do those early things, if they have that good foundation, then they're going to be able to read a lot better, right? And be able to identify new words and increase that reading fluency. So when we look at word analysis, this is just referring to how children approach written words and decode them to make meaning. So if a student is just able to, sound out letters They may not necessarily be making a word. And if a student, maybe a student is making a word, but they don't know what that word means, right? That could be another issue that students may have. So this is something that you want to work on with your students daily. If you keep continuing to do this, then students are going to start to have that skillful, rapid word recognition. So in the early grades, they work on sight words. And then as students get older, students' sight word bank starts to get bigger and bigger, right? They start seeing these words more frequently, more often. And so they start to memorize them. So they're not necessarily reading them all, right? But literally it's just they have them memorized. For us, when we're reading, a lot of the stuff that we're reading, we've seen these words so often, we just read them like nothing. And that's kind of where we want to get our students going. Research shows that fluent word identification has to occur before children can actually comprehend the text. So if students are taking a really long time to sound out every little thing that they're reading, then they're not comprehending anything, right? Because all they're focused on is making words out of those sounds, right? And so same thing goes if you actually have a student, if in class you say, okay, we're going to read from the book, right? And if you have a student read from the book and you can see that they're really struggling to read, they're not getting anything out of it, right? They're not going to be comprehending anything, or, like there's kind of no point to that, right? Especially if the student is a struggling reader, because if you're trying to do it to have them grasp knowledge, they're not, right? So that's something that you have to work on. And that's when we want to make sure that all of our students are skillful readers so that they're actually able to understand what it is that they're reading. So when it comes to word recognition, these are some like 4 main ways that students can work on that. So the first one is going to be that sight vocabulary. And so like I mentioned, as students see them, right, they'll start to memorize them. And so there's really no thinking or no reading involved. It's just kind of like, it's automatic, right? That they just see it and, oh, that's the word the, right? I don't even have to sound it out. Not that sounding it out is going to help me much, right? Because the T and the H make something different. Sight words are one way. And then in another text that I was going through, so this is another book that I looked at as well. I don't know if for some of you may have purchased it. So this one also has it goes through information for your tests. So with this one, they actually refer to them as Dolch words, okay? Or I don't know if I'm saying that right. But basically there was a study a long time ago, and this man found that if we actually taught like kids words that they're gonna see very often, right? Like the and of and a and a, if we just teach them to memorize them, then it's actually gonna help them to read faster, which makes sense, right? They don't have to waste time actually sounding them out. It's something they're going to see all the time. So why waste the time? And so again, as students are going to grow, their sight vocabulary is going to increase, and it's just going to help them to be more fluent readers. And when we do this, when we're working on sight words, it's not enough to just have students memorize like what the word says, but you also want to have students practice spelling them out as well. So if they know that this is the word the, then when you ask them, how do you spell the word the, right? They should be able to say THE. So kind of doing both of that, because again, that's going to help them with being fluent writers as well. Then there's going to be phonic generalizations, and these are going to be strategies used to introduce word recognition and decoding skills. So again, these examples here, the bullets, like I said, my son, they play a video for him every day, and it says like E-double-E sounds like E, right? So it has little rhymes. It has hand motions that he does with them, and they go through a whole bunch of just generalizations. And so they're rules that are going to mostly apply. And again, it's just teaching students these so that as they move on, they memorize what that's going to happen, and so they don't get confused by the weird English language and all of its crazy rules. Then there's going to be structural analysis. So this would be looking at base and root words, affixes and suffixes. And this not only helps them with reading in general, but also like, coming from science, when I think of science, if students are able to identify, roots and prefixes and suffixes, then when they see vocabulary in science, they're able to analyze the word and figure out what it actually means. So a lot of the words are going to come from, or should I say morphemes are going to come from foreign languages such as Greek and Latin, but they have consistent meanings. And so you'll also see that in Spanish and English, there's going to be some roots and suffixes and prefixes that have the same meanings. So if we can show students what those meanings are, then we can help them make that connection from English to Spanish and vice versa. Okay, other things that students can use are going to be clues. So there are context clues. And that would be, you know, maybe there's pictures right in the lower grades. There's going to be pictures in the text, or there's, you know, types of speech, or maybe, you know, just other clues around whatever it is that they're reading. There's semantic clues. So that's when students think about what the meaning might be based on what makes sense. So for example, in that video that we just watched with the student, and he read the wrong thing, you know, she asked him like, does that make sense? You know, and so after thinking about it, it's like, oh no, well, you know, so it might be this instead, okay? And then synecdoche clues would be using the order of the words in a sentence to determine meaning. So, right, if I have that sentence there, dogs are blank, that's making me think that that missing word is either an adjective or a noun. So again, that's just, you know, little clues to kind of teach students so that they can read on their own. Then with that, right, we're going to run into some challenges. So some comprehension challenges that students can run into would be homophones. So these are where words sound the same but are spelled differently, and they have different meanings. So for example, we have the word blue and blue. So they're spelled different and they mean different things, but they sound exactly the same, right? We've got here and here. Then there are homographs. So these are spelled the same, but they have more than one pronunciation and different meanings. So we've got bow or we've got bow. Okay, so, but it's spelled exactly the same. And then compound words can also be difficult for early readers. So if I have a basket and I have ball, right, they mean two different things, but if I put them together, I get a basketball. And so a student that especially may be new to the language, they may not understand what that actually is. So in the early grades, you don't start with compound words, right? Like in first grade, you're not reading compound words. But you know, as they get older, you know, definitely in fourth grade, they're going to be looking at compound words. Now, when it comes to word analysis, again, there has to be an assessment component. So one example of assessing word identification would be miscue analysis. And so with this one, it's a procedure to just assess the student's oral reading. So you would actually have the student read something, and you would tell them that you won't be able to help them. The reading will be a little bit more challenging than the reading level that they're at, and you actually record what they read. Then the students will listen to it and they'll kind of analyze how they read it. And then you as a teacher can go through and make notes of, you know, any mistakes that they may have made, not necessarily in like the words, but maybe in the sounds. Maybe they're not blending something, maybe they're not saying sounds correctly. And then when it comes to correcting the miscues, you can ask them questions to help them to, you know, so that when we ask them questions, instead of just giving them the answer, we're also giving them those tools that they can use later on, right? So as they're reading on their own. And in some cases, you know, if we're just trying to work on that fluency, you might just want to provide the students the word to just keep that flow of reading going. Okay, so it just kind of depends on where the student is at. And so when it comes to reading fluency, that's the ability to decode words quickly and accurately. And just like the little boy, right, he kind of mentioned, like, I'm reading for fluency. So make sure that the words have the right stress, they have the right pitch, right, right intonation pattern. So, you know, reading with like feeling the way you actually talk. And so in children in first grade, they should be able to read about 60 words correctly per minute. Okay, so you do have to know reading fluency numbers. So children in first grade should be able to read about 60 words correct per minute. And then that rate should increase by 10 words in each successive grade, right? So in second grade, they should read 70, and third grade, they should read 80, and so on and so forth. And then students in middle school should be reading at about 120 to 150 words correctly per minute. So that's in those grade levels. Yes.
For the 60 words correct, is this by the end of first grade or?
Yes, yeah, it should be by the end of first grade.
Okay.
And then they do say correctly, because when you're assessing students, like especially in the lower grades in kindergarten, first grade, maybe even second grade, the teachers will actually give the these assessments like individually. So they'll literally have a student read, and the teacher is literally there marking like check, 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 oh, wrong, you know, and then they literally count it. So they literally count how many words they do in a minute, like it's literally timed. Now, when it comes to, you know, working on literacy, there is this idea of balanced literacy. I heard this a lot going around in the schools. And so with balanced literacy, what this means is that like in a block, so you have like a literacy block, you want to make sure that you're doing all 4 of these things. And so again, this was something that I know I was in the Socorro district for a long time. This was something that they were really trying to work on because they realized they weren't doing enough of it. With balanced literacy, you have like a chunk of time where you read aloud to the students and you literally model that reading process, like just like that, you know, systematic explicit instruction. So you read it, the kids listen, you know, you go through all of that, and then you actually have shared reading. So the students may be reading with a partner, doing possibly choral reading, or they're reading as a group. So at the whole table, everybody's reading the words, the book together or story together. And then you could have some guided reading where maybe you have a small group and you're working with the students to kind of help them as they go along. And then there has to be independent reading. So this is balanced literacy, and something that I know in our district, I don't know about everywhere else, but they were kind of missing that independent reading, or they were missing the read aloud, like they were skipping one of those. And so when we think about this balanced literacy idea, you have to really model to students what reading and what good reading should look like, right? And how we do that. So telling them the thinking that goes behind it. Then we have to provide them the support. So I could kind of think of that as like the I do, the we do, and the you do, right? And then you have to give students that opportunity to practice reading on their own. Okay, so we got a few more questions here. Okay, so this one this one shows some more of those strategies, and I'll go ahead and leave that one so you can watch that one later on your own. Okay, so with this next link, if you click on this link, it's going to take you to the TExES vertical alignment. It should, oh wait, this isn't working for me. Is it letting you click on the link? No.
No, ma'am.
Oh, try this one. Did that one work? Yes, okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so if you look at your competencies, it mentions knowing, where is it? Ongoing assessment. It talks about knowing the levels from like different grade levels for each of those components. I do not see it on here. Oh my gosh, I can't find it. So I know one of the descriptors mentions knowing how the reading is gonna like, or ELAR, the TEKs are gonna progress. So on this link, which you can see, and it depends on your handbook. So I know for the EC6, you have to know how what is like the vertical alignment for grades 4th through 6th. And I know in one of these, I know I'm missing it somewhere, but in one of these for the 4th through 8, you have to know how the vertical alignment from 4th through 8th grade. So on this link, what you can do is click the different grade levels, and you'll be able to actually see how they build on each other. And you'll notice that they're organized by grade level, and then they are organized by SE. But it also kind of tells you, like this one, for example, is saying phonological awareness, print concepts, and all that. So, excuse me, all that stuff that we talked about there, it's going to be taught in basically 4th and 5th grade. So that's kind of where that should be happening. And you can kind of see how it progresses. When we get to those foundational language skills, so listening, speaking, reading, writing, and thinking, again, you can see how it progresses from 4th through 8th grade. Okay, so I don't know if anybody found it, but I know it was in there somewhere. I know clearly in the EC6 it mentions it, and I know I saw it in the 4th through 8th. Somewhere in there it says that. So it will tell you specifically what it is that you're looking for, and I don't remember if it was specifically with the reading or with the writing or speaking. It was one of those, but it was looking at how the TEKs are going to be progressing as they get older. So just kind of go through those. All right, so then on this link here, I went ahead and I included the link to Reading Rockets, and this one provides some intervention strategies. So things that you can do with students that are having reading problems. So if you click on this link, I mentioned Reading Rockets earlier. So Reading Rockets has a whole bunch of resources to help you when it comes to reading. And everything in here is research-based. So one of the descriptors talks about identifying, like being able to assess a student and then identifying what it is that they need so that you can help them. So this website will give you a bunch of different strategies, but this article here specifically talks about interventions for students with reading problems. And it also refers to students that are a little bit older. So like 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, if you're having students that are struggling readers, right? Those are older kids. You're going to be using different strategies than you would for like kids in elementary school, okay? So this is something that you can take a look at later and just kind of read about how you could do that and some best practices and strategies. And then I would definitely, if this is an area that you are struggling in with ELAR, bookmark the Reading Rockets. So it does have a lot of different strategies, like we were talking about that earlier. And it also talks about those best practices for just teaching reading in general. So that's about it. I hope you enjoyed the review session, and please follow us on social media. Thank you.